Audio on demand from Vision Christian Media.
The story.
I remember the morning after this tragic event and just waking up and having that sense of sort of remembering what had happened the day before and realising, that he had gone. But having this sort of thought come into my head, well, your life is like a book, and that was part one, and this is now part two.
G'day, I'm Jimmy Colfax. Welcome to The Story. Well, our guest today is once again Amanda Donahoe. She's sharing her life journey and how she eventually becomes the CEO of Servants Community Housing in Melbourne, which is a charity that houses homeless people. Last time, we heard how the Lord cultivated in her a heart for helping the oppressed and the marginalised in society. Also, we heard how she met her future husband, who had a similar calling. We ended as Amanda and her husband began to serve as managers at their church's rooming house in Melbourne in the 1980s. Now we'll hear what happened next in their lives as Amanda Donahoe continues her chat with Eric Scatterbo in our Melbourne studios.
Okay, so you saw a lot of the men there, mostly men.
Yeah.
A lot of alcohol, unemployment, and drugs, some drugs.
Yeah, not the drugs of choice back then tended to be like a lot of marijuana, and I think alcohol was the main drug that caused us grief back then. So
because people would come home drunk and things like that?
Alcohol fueled violence.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Was sometimes an issue. Yep. We did have one time that we were just asleep and we just suddenly heard this stomping, running down the side path, and it sounded like it was definitely, at least three people, if not more. And so we sort of sprang out of bed, and it turned out that these people had been looking for someone in the boarding house, a fairly new resident, and that person, there'd been some sort of drug deal gone wrong, and so they were looking for payment, and they were barging, like trying to open people's doors, and they opened the door of one very vulnerable woman and hit her. She had nothing to do with it. It was just, she hadn't locked her door that night. And so my husband was on the street waiting for the police, and these guys left, but then they jumped into a car, and as they were turning around, they came back and they saw my husband on the street, and they left out of the car and they bashed him. So that was one of the more sort of not so great moments. But yeah.
Well, I mean, you're helping. You're like, Lord, we're here to help people.
Yeah.
We're not making millions of dollars here. And then to be beaten.
Yeah.
It's got to be hard.
Yeah. It was obviously not great, but fortunately those sort of things didn't happen all the time, Yeah.
And you did that for 4 years?
Yeah, we did. Yeah. And during that time, I had two more children, so we went.
So in the middle of all that, you have children living there.
Yeah,
your children living with you.
And I think that the children being on site is just so important for the residents that are there. That some of them have had children and don't see the children anymore.
Were your children safe?
We didn't leave them alone outside. We'd always, if they're riding their bikes in the car park or something, we would always be there. But we didn't ever feel that they were threatened. Like, it was interesting because they would have heard every swear word under the sun and more, but they never brought it inside the home. And I think that was a really enriching experience for them to be exposed.
In a different kind of way.
Yeah. And look, three of them have come back and worked for Servants Community Housing as adults. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And they've, all five of them, in fact, four of them have come back, and the fifth one's done some relief work. So when I add them all up, they've all had some sort of connection back with the organisation.
So it obviously made a lasting impression.
Yeah. And they're all very compassionate sort of kids that adults now. But
So that all ended. What happened? Where did you go from there?
Then we went to Central Victoria. We decided to be part of a church plant there, and in that...
Did you just desperately want to get out of there, or what was your motivation?
Like
Had enough?
4 years was enough. Yep. It's a bit like living in a fishbowl, and you can do it for so long. And then, people would know when we're coming, when we're going, our routine. And, that it's...
Wears on you.
It does, yes. And the constant being on, because it's not like you go to work every day and then you come home. You're always on. So
you wouldn't have that separation. That
no, we
most
used to
people would
get out every Saturday. We just had a little. My husband was very good at that. Like, okay, we get out every Saturday, and of course there's no mobile phone. So when you get out, you are out. And we would try and go away for a long weekend every 6 weeks, and the church would put someone into the position to relieve us. So that was sort of our sanity saver. But then when it was time to go, we decided that we would be part of this church plant. We had no money, couldn't buy a house then, and then we needed to rent somewhere. But there wasn't a lot of accommodation, like particularly if we had 4 kids. And so 2 weeks before we were due to move out, we still didn't have a place to go. And my husband decided to drive around and see what he's driving around the area, and could see a little house, the little peak of a roof of a house, and realised, I hadn't seen that one before. And it was a little farm. The gate was locked. He jumped the gate, went over to the house, realised it was empty, then went up the road, knocked on a neighbour's door, found out who owned the empty house. Turned out that it was someone that lived about 50 k's away, and we got the phone number, and then we decided, the people said, I may be interested in renting it out to you. So we swapped cars for my brother. He had a better car than what we did, and we bundled the little baby. We just didn't take all 4 kids. We just took the tiny little one, went up to visit these people, and they were lovely. They were Anglicans, and they, when they heard what we had been doing and how we were trying to do this church plant in this new location, they said, oh, sure, you can rent the house. We use it as a weekender, but don't worry, and they gave it to us for $50 a week.
Oh, wow.
A week. So that was pretty amazing, given that we had to, we were sort of starting to sweat a bit, we're about to be homeless ourselves.
Right, exactly.
So
the Lord provided.
That was pretty
great.
special, yeah. So we stayed there for a while, and that was great, but 18 months in, and for a long period of that time, my husband had been unemployed because there was a recession and nobody was hiring environmental health officers. He got a job about an hour away, but again, we felt
So he wasn't supposed to be the pastor of the church?
We were supporting,
plant. Okay.
That's right, yeah. And so we was still thinking again, okay, what's the next step? It felt a bit like this was just a bit of respite after our 4 years at the rooming house, and a job came up in Arnhem Land in northern Australia, working with Indigenous people as an environmental health officer. So we packed up our bags and moved north. So
far north.
Very far north. When you look at it on the map, I remember standing in my lounge room with my mother, and we were looking at this map, and I could see her face, and I'm also thinking, I don't know that I want to be that far away from my mum, but anyway, we did, and so Mum and her husband came up every year very faithfully and visited us up there.
So your husband had a secular job, but were you involved in ministry as well?
So of course I got up there, and then 9 months later I had another child, so I had the fifth one.
So you were pretty busy.
Pretty busy then, but then got an amazing job at an Indigenous community about 20 kilometres away from the main. It was almost like apartheid. We were very much in the white township, and the Indigenous communities were spread around Arnhem Land, and my husband had, in his role, was flying in and out to a lot of the communities, where I had a job that was 20 k's away, and I was working as a manager in a women's resource centre there. So
once again, helping out.
Very, very much. These are people on the poverty line. So this was my role, was trying to. It was a community development role, trying to get little social enterprises up and running, and doing education, health education, economics, finances, literacy. So, and a job that I could actually take my children to. So, in all ways, it was just an awesome job.
Okay. So then what happened?
So we stayed another 3 years there, and then we moved over to Darwin, but to work with Indigenous people again. So the same cohort, so people that basically don't speak English, adults.
So once again, the Lord led you into your sweet spot.
Yep.
What your heart
we just sort of
was leaning toward.
Yeah. And then one weekend, the two middle kids were off on a church camp, and I took the youngest one down to the video shop, and it had been a wet day, and my husband had been chopping the little palm trees that are forever springing up in the garden in Darwin. And when I came home, there was an emergency services vehicle outside, like the Power and Water Authority, and people that fix your electricity was blocking my driveway. And so I parked the car and came around the truck and found, was watching my son doing CPR on my husband. And what had happened had been that the tree had fallen on the power line. My husband had called the Power and Water Authority. They had come to the house. They had a chat to my husband, who was very embarrassed about the mayhem that he'd caused. Over the radio, it said, all good to go, power's off. And so my husband took it upon himself to go and push the tree off the power line. And he pushed it off, and of course the power had been switched off something like 15 k's away or something in another area. And so the tree was actually live, so my husband was electrocuted and never, basically never revived. So
so they mistakenly turned off power in the wrong spot?
Yeah. And it was just a tragic mistake.
You're listening to The Story. Our guest today is once again Amanda Donahoe. She's sharing her life journey and how she eventually becomes the CEO of Servants Community Housing in Melbourne. Sadly, we just heard how her husband was tragically killed in 2006, and suddenly Amanda's partner in ministry was gone. Next, we'll hear how the Lord eventually tugs her heart back to Melbourne and back to the rooming house where they had originally served 20 years earlier. All that and more when we return.
If this program has highlighted something you'd like prayer for, we'd love to pray for you. Call 1-800-PRAY-FOR-ME. That's 1-800-772-936. It's a free call. Or text 0401 132 888.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Colfax, and this is The Story. We're back with more of Amanda Donahoe, who's sharing her life journey today and how she eventually becomes the CEO of Servants Community Housing in Melbourne. Before the break, we heard how her husband tragically died in 2006 when they were living in Darwin. Now, we'll hear what happened next in Amanda's life as she continues her chat with Eric Scatterbo.
So suddenly...
Yeah. Suddenly.
You have 5 kids.
5 kids.
And you're a single mother.
Yep. So the youngest was 11 and the oldest was 20. College was fantastic. They let me have 6 weeks off. Then I had to go back to work, which I did. It was good to have something to think about and think about what to do next.
Well, also, your partner...
Yeah, well, that's right.
Gone.
That's exactly right.
This was always a partnership.
Yes.
Helping out.
That's right. And I remember the morning after this tragic event and just emerging, waking up and having that sense of sort of remembering what had happened the day before and realising, that he had gone. But having this sort of thought come into my head, well, that was, your life is like a book, and that was part 1, and this is now part 2. And you have to work out what your part 2, and I don't want to it was just like, okay, so, and that was like the reason to get out of bed, I had to get the kids breakfast, and we had to keep going, but I had to do it alone. we had, as you've picked up, we were very much a partnership of doing things together. So to be having to think all the time, there's nobody to talk, nobody to bounce the idea off, nobody to think, where are we next? What's our next sort of exciting adventure? Because he really was, as I alluded to in the beginning, he was the adventurer. Almost, if there was a leader in the relationship, it was him, and then he's not there.
Yeah. There's a void in your life.
Very much a void. Very much, best friend. When you're living with your best friend, and then there's just nothing. So, yeah.
Now, at this point, nobody would blame you to just lick your wounds, kind of play it safe. But that doesn't sound like you, somebody who jumps in a freezing cold young river.
Yeah. For the first year, I just threw myself into triathlons like I'd never done.
Right?
I'd never done any sport, I
did not see that coming.
No, I
should have.
No, I'd been dabbling a little bit, and I'd been trying to convince my husband to do it as well. And he'd done a few little races, and it was just a little thing up at Darwin. In Darwin, it was a great little club, but it meant that I had people that I saw every morning and every afternoon because the training regime was pretty full on, and they became, my little extra family for a while because. Yeah, I look back now and think, that's what they were. I just needed to, it was like a bit of escapism and, learned things like you can cry underwater, you can cry when you're running. And I couldn't cry necessarily on the bike because I generally rode on the bike with a group of people we trained together. But the swimming and the running was often solo, and so shed a lot of tears, a lot of grief during that time. So I think it was a very therapeutic sort of thing to do. But
and healthy.
And healthy, yeah. So, didn't drown my sorrows in drink, but just threw myself into this stuff. And the kids were, the two older kids, we all had different ways of dealing with it. And, I guess we were sort of there for each other, but we were very much all doing it our own way.
Which is so often the case with grief.
Yeah. And the two older ones had sort of been drifting a little bit, and they did an about face, and they went off and studied. And my daughter is now a senior legal advisor with the Victorian Legal Aid Service. So there's.
But once again, helping people.
And the middle child was like getting into what most kids in Darwin tend to do around 17, 18, and that's. A lot of partying, a lot of alcohol, a lot of party drugs, and then my younger son was sort of starting at 14 or something, starting to go a little bit wobbly, and I thought, I think my now might be the time when I need to go back to Melbourne. But
and of course, your mother.
Mum, yeah.
Back
so
Mum
was there, and she's remarried, and so they were here, and my brothers, and I still had connections and friends down in Melbourne. I just figured that being surrounded by family and friends might be good for the family. And with the middle child, I couldn't get him to move down. It's sad, but I thought, well, he can stay here in Darwin, and I'll go down to Melbourne with the younger ones. But I didn't have a job, and I didn't have a home.
That's pretty important.
Yeah, that's
factor.
Right. And
need to live somewhere. You need to make a living.
I had I'd studied hospitality after that was my hotel management was what I'd studied, and I thought, maybe I'll go back, do some sort of hospitality thing. Maybe I'll buy a coffee shop. So I love coffee, so why not buy a coffee shop? And then
what could be better?
That's it. Back in 2010, there was not a coffee shop on every street corner. It was
before
actually
the big coffee craze.
Yeah, would have been a good time to buy a coffee shop. And so, my daughter was sending me photos of coffee shops that were for sale and designs, and really going down that road. But on the way to work one day, I was listening to the radio, and a program came on about a street-to-home program for homelessness people. And I was just entranced and listening and intrigued and, what are these things that they're doing? Sounds great. And got to the car park at work and stayed listening to the whole program, and then went up the stairs into my office, sort of sat down at the computer and just had one of those aha moments where you just think, look, your heart is, you love coffee. Doesn't mean you have to sell it,
Just drink it.
Where your heart is, what God has laid on your heart for a long time is dealing with people that are marginalised, poor, oppressed, the widow, the prisoners, setting the blind free. What on earth you think about a coffee shop for, really, And so it's like,
it'd be something to do.
Yes, it would have bought me a job, But because I don't have a social work background, I just couldn't,
So how's
these
that gonna
days,
work?
yeah, that's right. How am I going to get a job if I don't have a social work degree? Am I going to go back to uni? What will I do? And then, of course, I remembered, Hawthorn West Baptist Church and the rooming house. Maybe, do you think they would take a single woman with a couple of teenage kids back in that manager's flat? So I rang them up, talked to the CEO, still very small. They've still got one house, but the managers that were there were due to be leaving in a few months. And
timing.
They did not have a manager. And as you can imagine, it's not the easiest job in the world to fill. Who would really want to go and live with 38 people with a whole lot of issues? So I met the CEO, and some of the people from the church still remembered who I was.
How many years later is this?
What is this? 20 years later.
Oh, okay.
So,
wow.
15, 20 years later. So
What year was this?
this was 2010.
Okay.
So the CEO was like, yeah, and he was a risk taker. So it was good that I had the CEO in there that was a risk taker, I'm CEO now. Would I do the same thing again? Probably not. But it was great for me. So I landed back there. I had the house. I had the
Were you living in the
kids.
same
Yeah, it was so weird. Oh my gosh, it was so weird because my husband had done a lot of the maintenance-y type stuff, and the first time I had to there was a problem with the hydronic heating. I'm thinking, so angry because he wasn't there, angry with him, and just like,
So who's going to do that?
Who's going to do that? And I can't even remember now how I got around that. I found someone to help me out.
Well, unfortunately, we're quickly running out of time, but you were back where you had been 20-some years earlier in the role as a manager like you had been in the past, but that time, of course, with your husband, now by yourself. And eventually, you become the CEO of the ministry. How did that come about?
The organisation was growing, so we now have 4 houses that we lease, so they're all large. So now we're housing 96 people. So I was able to, as we grew, we suddenly needed an operations manager, which...
And you had management experience
Yeah,
from
that's right. I'd been
what you've
in the
done in the
executive
past.
leadership team up in Darwin, and was able to do the operations role and then experience, and I studied housing management and policy, so it gave me a little bit of theory around the practical. And then so when the previous CEO resigned, I applied and I guess fell into the role.
And what year was that?
That was 2017, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
and obviously you're ministering to people, to their physical needs, housing. What about spiritually? How do you feel that you're ministering to these people that otherwise would be homeless? How are you ministering to them spiritually?
I go to church on Sunday morning sometimes and think, gee, I don't know that I can do this job anymore. Like sometimes it's just really tough because there's often issues, But I often find that I guess God speaks to me and through songs, through words. And it's just like the encouragement to keep serving the poor and the oppressed. It's like there's always something there that says keep going, and I think it's as we serve others, we are. God says to love other people, and that's how we're serving people spiritually. And we're not there to evangelise, but we're there to care and to love. And I really believe that through love, things happen in people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And they know you're a Christian.
Yeah. Sometimes they'll say, "You call yourself a Christian," just as you're sort of showing them the door.
Throwing it in your face.
That's right.
Wasn't the ideal that you were thinking about,
No,
but at least they
right.
know.
Yeah, they know that the church is closely connected with the organisation, and they know that a lot of the staff do go to church or.
So seeds are being planted.
Yeah, and sometimes people become Christians.
Mm-hmm.
It's just interesting watching God work sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for sharing your life story with us and how God has worked through your life. I'm still not sure about this whole jumping in the cold river, but the rest of it, you have a wonderful story of how God was working in your life. Thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Thanks, Eric.
Well, that was part 2 of Eric Scatterbo's conversation with Amanda Donahoe, who's now the CEO of Servants Community Housing in Melbourne, which is a charity that houses homeless people. And it was amazing to hear how the Lord worked in her life and led her right back to the ministry where it had all began for her and her husband 20 years earlier. To find out more about Servants Community Housing, their website is servants.org.au. Once again, that's servants.org.au. We'll end today with this appropriate verse from the book of Proverbs, chapter 14, verse 31. It says, "He who oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honours God." Well, thanks so much for joining us for part 2 of Amanda Donahoe's story and how the Lord led her on a kind of a circular route to where it all began for her. Until next time, I'm Jimmy Colfax, encouraging you to share your story with someone today.
The story. Just another way Vision is helping you look to God daily.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.